Okay. We know from before that while handy to know for understanding, but perspective theory might be even inhibiting if we get the cart and the horse not in the right order. For example, last time I emphasized that while most instruction in perspective theory kind of begins with something about a horizon line, I instead recommend that you think of that as eye level, basically meaning this: your relationship to where you stand, right? A little further up here, down there, this is our center. Okay, so while we may not be able to see a horizon line unless we're in a desert, we always have an eye level. We always have our relationship of here and our vertical center. So this axis okay, we can actually see evidence of it. Not that these things really exist, but if I stand in some relationship to a building, I might see some line falling in some place, right? And I know that my relationship to it is that it is above my eye level and to my right. I can find that. And if I find that, I can find, other evidence on the building probably that fits into this stuff. And then below, reflecting that axis. We'll try to talk about that today. Okay, but the axes, you don't get confused, because this is about us, the viewer. And when you teach one point, perspective, you don't want to impart a sense that, when you go out in the world, to always expect a tunnel or a parking garage, or one of these examples in which it seems like all lines converge to one vanishing point. Don't go out in the world expecting that. There will be times that you see it. You'll be in a corridor, or you'll be somewhere where you'll really see, oh, wow, 1 point perspective. But most of the time, it's more complicated than that, and there's a lot of different vanishing points, and I'll show you examples. Also, don't look for vanishing points. As per last time, if we got railroad tracks out in the desert, we might actually get to see that nice triangular point happen on a horizon. But most of the time, we're going to see angles, but we're not going to actually see where things converge. Okay. 2-point perspective. To review real quickly. Again, we often see simplistic diagrams in which we'll have a horizon line, a vanishing point, some building which we can see two sides of, and then the diagram goes like such. Look, there's 1 point, here's another, here's our building, see, 2. So it's like we get to see kind of evidence of axes going that way, evidence of axes going this way. That will only work out nicely if you have large buildings out in the middle of nowhere, where you'll be able to see that clearly. So this is the idea. And I've got an example that's not that far off, but you'll see once you get into the real world, we don't just have like concrete vaults in Nevada where it is this simple. Architecture is more complicated, so around here we may have something going on with the roof, and that's got to get a little bit big. That's got to reflect the axis, get a little bit bigger as it comes towards us. Okay, maybe it has arched entryways somewhere, and we'll need a line for that because those, in perspective will get bigger as they come towards us, and so forth. An example of two-point perspective. All right. Now here, this would be the one side, this would be the other. It's got parts, right? But there's a bunch of stuff over here that would converge to a point. A bunch of stuff over here that would converge to a point. But there's some architectural information making it more complicated. When you're drawing something like this being somewhere you could actually go and you could stand on the street, and you have something like this, which has its own thing going on. The lines of these windows will not go to the exact same place that this does. And whatever's going on in this building will not do the exact same thing as those. Space is different like that. And unless everything is built on a really, really tidy grid, it's usually pretty, each building has its own set of stuff. And that's all right. Be prepared for that. One of the other things that I emphasized last time was don't forget everything else you've learned in this drawing class while you're thinking about angles. Matter of fact, be sure you don't replace seeing shapes and things like that, values. If you do all that well, you wouldn't necessarily need to know anything about this. And of course, vanishing points are theoretical. There isn't an actual dot somewhere that I can find. It's where these lines would converge, because things that are parallel, eventually would. But if I think too much about that, I might just diminish my ability to study that as a shape. And we would want to have that in tandem, right? So I'm doing some structural line stuff. And maybe I'm just doing this before I even think about perspective rules. Maybe I'm just thinking about structural drawing. And I know that this has to be bigger, a little higher here than it is back there, because this is closer to me. Things get smaller as they go back into space. I expect the pinch, as I call it, the pinch, which is really the reflection of things on that axis. But to draw all this perfectly right out of the chute is not my goal. Rather, I want to try and just establish the kind of lines of the axis. Like if I know, this is one of the most common errors, is students will study long and hard the really, really clear things that reflect perspective, like the top of the building. At the very top of the building versus the sky, work hard on that for a long time, try to work out those angles. Problem is that if I just do that, I feel like, well, that's not too bad. Then I don't want to go down onto the building and forget about that. Because if this is the right angle, I can expect some kind of reflection. I want to actually kind of draw loosely information about that axis down here, because it'll be there, and there'll be a sort of like donk, 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 donk. See here, getting close to eye level. And we can even see here that this ever so slightly begins to go the other way. So my eye level is probably somewhere in there. Somewhere in there would be a straight line. That information I want on my page. If I just draw that and then say, all right, screw it, and start making the rest of it up all by itself, it's not going to look right. It's not going to look like the building was built level. You know, and probably the biggest place I see people do this is doors and windows. They'll work hard on this angle. Okay, now I got the perspective right, and then go down and draw like a door, totally by itself, doing its own thing. And the top of that door has to reflect the same kind of axis as this does, you know, if the builders were doing things level and true. Okay, so spend time, no fear of the stray line, working that stuff out, but don't abandon it once you get the biggest one. Okay, because if this is the right angle, now this building doesn't have a lot of that kind of window stuff, but you'll see examples that I show you that do. If this is the right angle here, you're going to have some of this going on, some more of that same axis. If I've drawn this and I've played it a little safe, you remember last time I was talking about how we tend to make stuff look a little more normal, and I have. Catch that. Same as any other sort of thing, like, whoa, wait a minute, that is a little, I'm making it a little safer. Catch it and correct it and replace it with the more dramatic angle that you actually see. Don't be afraid to, you know, if there's a bigger pinch here and a wackier angle underneath there, you know, like just keep after it. Figure it out. The working out of that kind of stuff will probably be less, you know, see, we always think we're going to screw up our drawing. You're not going to screw up your drawing. You're going to learn something. And if your drawing gets kind of convoluted, you know, and you have to clean it up with an eraser or something like that, well, that's fine. And it's not even that bad of a thing to have to say, okay, I'm going to hit it again. I've learned a lot. I'm getting a good understanding of this, but I'm still being, you know, a little tentative about this or that or whatever. Yeah, but what have I really done here? A few minutes. It's a sketch. Okay, so don't be afraid, you know, to change it or to draw it again. Now, I actually think I'm still a little, you know, I could spend a little bit more time tweaking this and working on this angle that I'm addressing right now. But I want to show you, you know, the main thing that's good when you're doing this architectural drawing is to put heavier line weights on stuff that you're sure of, or to double up on your lines. But it also can be great to just fill in, you know, if an area is all in shadow, and you'll find places where this makes total sense and places where it doesn't, you know, to fill something like that in. Okay, press down a little harder, so on. Remember that your verticals, unless something is getting super high and up into the sky, you can kind of count on your verticals to be vertical. It's stuff that would be horizontal. If I stood perpendicular to this, it might just look horizontal, right? Like if I got myself over around here and stood in a certain place, a lot of this could just look like horizontal stack of lines. But then I'm standing here, so good angles to work out. But, you know, draw the same way throughout the whole process. When things get crazy, when there's a little skyway or something like that in this case, try to stay in the same sort of mode of architectural drawing, right? And Again, over here, I've got to figure out axis stuff. Scoot this over, see, you know, I would do well to get all of that lightly and loosely kind of figured out. You know, I'm a little off here because I'm getting to straight line a little prematurely. But I know that by the time I get to the plaza, I'm exaggerating a little bit here, but I'm below eye level. Okay. Now, something about exaggeration. With perspective drawings and these kind of architectural drawings that we end up making, trying to talk about perspective. Here's the thing. If you hold back on stuff, this would be a great example right here. If you hold back and you kind of, you know, don't get enough of something, you're apt to look awkward. But if you exaggerate the truth, meaning if you've got the right angle, but it's a little exaggerated, like say down here, let's say the truth is actually a little less angle than that. It may look fine because what I've done is I've kind of exaggerated the truth. But if I just draw that straight across, when the truth is it does have a little angle on it, I might be putting myself into a little bit of tricky territory. So always remember that. Err on the side of, what the heck going on there? The share screen just vanished out of thin air. Good old Zoom. You know, exaggerating the right thing will come off okay. For example, if we just have cubes, and we tend to do this, I was talking about this last time, about how we'll keep it like this, okay? When it's actually crazier than that because we want it to be normal. But if we have to do a whole drawing in relation to all these other things, this may look a little awkward. I may be flipping it up to show more of the top, you know. I may need to do something more dramatic because it's closer to my eye level and so forth. If it's more like that than this, even if I've gone a little too far, this will look right. A little exaggeration of the truth will be okay. But if you hold back way too much, it'll look funny. Okay? Please remember that. Keep that in mind. And try to overdo the right angles, because most of the time what we do is we draw stuff like it's more normal in our minds than it actually is. We'll look at something like this and we'll take a lot of that angle away. Or even this one that's not as nutty as that, you know, we'll make it more sort of, you know, something you can do to check this kind of stuff when you're looking at it is simply hold your pencil out. Now, if in life, if we're out in the world, this means holding this up like so, you know, maybe closing one eye and squinting. But like, what are these angles? And they can become a lot easier to see if you simply, you know, imagine this isn't a picture. This is actually a real space, and we're standing out here somewhere, and we're trying to draw this. What is this angle? What is that angle? Well, if I simply put my as level as I can hold it relative to my center, see how these triangles become easier to see? When I do that, it's a lot easier to just copy this triangle with my eye, as it were, than when I don't have a sort of like level line checking with. This is called sighting. On the figure, we call it measuring, and I don't usually do it when I'm working with it. It's like, well, how much angle is there there? How much angle is there there? Oh, maybe somewhere around here is eye level, right? So just a little of that and a little bit of this, because we can usually count on our verticals, but we can keep our footing pretty well, I think, if we just do that. Here I am, used to live there. Not that exact part, not that place in particular, that town. Crazy angles, right? Well, let's try for some of the big major information. There's lots of stuff going on. You heard me already talk about the windows and whatnot. What about things like this? Well, here's a place where lines would converge. Here's some big angles. We can see that, right? Not unlike railroad tracks. Bunch of steps on a steep street. More 2-point. Notice on this, I can see up under some of these things, but at some point I wouldn't be able to. Watch, watch the angles of the axes get closer to level. So there it is again. You're going to draw one of these buildings. You got to be prepared to figure out this kind of stuff. Start drawing this, don't expect yourself to go along from part to part and somehow hit it right. That's really hard to do. Work out stuff like this. Don't let any one thing take over your too much, and it will. Something that's non-architectural will usually do that. You'll get a shrub, or you'll get a car, or a darn telephone pole or something, and it'll throw you off. Okay, but this is going to take, sustained looking and looking back and forth and so forth, and you'll find that there's some pieces of info that reflect our friend the axes, and you can grab those and you can put those in with a little bit more conviction, and then you're off and running. Okay, but don't put a few pieces in there and then abandon the axes, because it affects the windows too. I can't draw these windows right if I don't have the axes lines in there that they're going to fit in. So for example, if I get this and I get that, I need these lines in between them to draw these windows. Otherwise, they're going to look awkward and look like they're doing their own thing and just floating around in there. Windows, right? We got windows. So there's lines. A building is going to have them, because they made all this stuff like level and they made it line up, right? So don't forget your verticals, stay vertical. You can count on them. Unless I get really close to this building and I look up, then I'll get old 3-point perspective and things will be pinched towards the sky. But from where I am now, far to the right, everything here is in the left quadrant of the axis. Can you see that? Angle, angle, angle. These are all angles, to the viewer's left. And where is eye level? Well, maybe somewhere. This doesn't look too, this right here tells me something. This looks pretty close to straight right there. So wherever I'm at, I'm not, I can figure it out. If I can figure out these, there'll be a place in which it looks like a straight line. Take your time and don't jump too fast. Maybe there on the top of that thing. Don't jump too fast to minor things until you've kind of worked that out. Those axes lines, they're the thing. You want them in place. So lots of drawing like this. So I've kind of got my wrist locked. It's the opposite of what I tell you when we're doing gesture drawing, which is to be all loosey-goosey. I'm saying to, go farther than you need to in length. People say, I can't draw a straight line. Well, I can't either. If I go like this and I just start trying to do the windows, and put them in like that, I'm going to have to be darn good. I need some lines that go like this. I'll keep them light, try to find their angles, and draw through, right? And eventually, when I believe that something is correct, they can be put in a little heavier, and I'll double up on them. It's like this entryway here. I'll press a little harder. Always remember to get in there. See, they got their own things going on. Some stuff is going to come out into the street a little farther. There won't just be one line here where everything stops. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. But you gotta have to keep it up. You got a little door here. You have to handle things in the same way. You can't work on axis lines for a couple of things and then just say, oh, okay, screw it. Now, same thing will happen. Sidewalk, it'll be more pinched up here on the right than it is down here. So keep reinforcing, your axes. Here's a good 2-pointer. It's not that bad. It has, it has beautiful architectural information up here. It has another building over here. The L train's going right by it. Cars, street. But it's not as far from those kind of examples as it could be. It's not that bad. There's a lot of sky. This is Harold Washington Library in Chicago. With this side and this side and that side. So, this is a 2-pointer, and it actually is a 3 too, because see this angle on and there's a little bit there. So of course, I don't want to have this accidentally getting a little wider towards the top. I want it to get a little more pinched as it goes up into space, and I don't have to get that perfect as long as I get this angling a little bit that way and a little bit that way, as if it would converge in space. Who knows how high in the sky that would actually be? I just don't want to reverse that. So if you establish, the major stuff that you need for drawing something that's in 2-point, like I said, again, I want to make sure this is angling a little bit inward rather than outward, because outward would look awkward. So my vertical is not perfectly vertical. It's pinched a little bit as it goes up. But I need axis lines for all this stuff. See these windows? I need that. It's a bummer. Damn, I just keep having to do work. I can't just go in there and, but if I want this to be right, and I want it to look right, I would say that's probably the number one thing I see people do that makes their drawings look awkward, is they'll get something like this going, but then when they go in to do windows and stuff, they'll just sort of like take it out of context, do them one by one. Their tops, you need lines of the axes for their tops. You need structural stuff, and you need perspective stuff and all of that. If you're gonna get it to look convincing, don't just try to do a window all by itself, one at a time. Once the light lines are in there, like if I've got a rhythm of lines on the side here, and I feel like the spacing's reasonable, just like if I was doing railroad ties or something like that, and I've got a line that I feel is good for the tops, that jives with the roof information, Well, then I can put them in, you know, these are big arched pieces of info, you know, but I might find, oops, shoot, don't have enough space there, you know, and quickly go back and try to reestablish that spacing again, because it's like, well, that's going to look funny because there's a bigger, you know, so let's start again. That one's about here and here, here. And if I'm afraid of doing straight lines and I'm nervous about all of that, I'm really going to give myself a hard time.
Structure.
So it's worth working out, because all the tops of those would line up, right? Now, see these lines? Uh, uh, uh. Same thing. Why is Zoom doing this today? What is Zoom's problem? Uh, I don't know. Then it came back without me actually doing anything. So who's to say? So I have to get some axes lines that are fairly correct through here too for that. And then it's the same job over here. But eventually, tedious as it may seem, you'll have some of this stuff in place and you can press down a little harder, double up on some of your lines, and then know the joys of putting in a few little tasty elements and having it look pretty correct, right? So
Yeah.
draw through, and again, these windows, if I just, here, don't just go in there and start doing this. It'll look bad. You'll get something backwards going the wrong way, you know, whatever the hell. Those will reflect in axes too. So lines that go across all of this will help you put those into the right places. Okay. But don't forget, once again, don't get so caught up in perspective theory. And again, I'm telling you to get this right. But you know, there's irregular things out there, and you've got equipment to you know, negative spaces, and you know, don't get so obsessed with especially not with vanishing points that you'll never find anyway. Remember that, you know, you have other tools, you have other drawing tools that you've learned to help you sort of figure this kind of stuff out. You know, for example, I can check versus this shape right there to get my angle right too. You know, I'm not I'm not without, you know, everything that we did prior to this. I've still got that, right? And in theory, if you were just great at seeing shapes, you would see these angles. And that's kind of what we want to do. We kind of want to be able to, because the angles are kind of about form. We have ideas in our head about, like, oh, there's windows and there, you know, we tend to do that. It's it, it sounds a little odd because we're looking at buildings, not faces, but we think of buildings as, oh, that's building is rectangular, these things, you know. So we tend to want to make lines of things not as angled as they are. Uh, but the idea is to simply get that when we look at something like this, we're taking in information like that as much as we might anything else. You know, that we see this. We tend to look at it and say, oh, there's this, brutalist architecture, or there's this, and we think, okay? But you'll find that if you do enough of this kind of drawing, like any other kind of drawing, you'll start seeing the forms, right? It doesn't always have to be solely a test of perspective. For example, if I was drawing something like this still of this site, which was in the movie Parasite, I might not think. I actually can tell you that I don't. I know this stuff, but I probably would not think about perspective theory. Now, you need that stuff when you're learning. When you're learning, there's stuff you need. You might be getting the ends of things, backwards. Things are getting bigger as they go back into space. If something like that is happening, you absolutely need to familiarize yourself with perspective theory, and you need to practice and so forth. But you've heard me talk about everything else. Is like first you have to hold it like seeing negative spaces. First time you have to try really hard, and you have to hold that in your head and do exercises, and But the idea is eventually, when you're looking, it's incorporated, so that I'm just as apt to see this in here as I am to see that in this. I'm just as apt to see changes in light and dark as I am to see contours or edges. And I'm just as apt to see the angle of, even if it's tight and it's doing something crazy from where I stand, I'm just as apt to see the angle of a railing as I am to think to myself, well, there is a railing, okay? Which is, before we train our eyes in drawing, that may be all we do, which is, there is the railing. It is made of, aluminum or something, or steel. And, like to actually be able to observe with a trained, practiced eye, all this information at once. So in doing a drawing like this, I may do angle work, like I may do something that would classify as a perspective day thing and get the angle right, like that. Something like this would be an example of that. But I also may be switching back and forth and reading some information about light and dark shapes. And, I suppose when you look at something and it has an angle and you get that angle right, that would be successful perspective work. But it also might have just been a well-observed shape matter too. So don't forget or abandon everything else that has, been worked upon this semester. So I know when I'm doing this, and I might be thinking about something else while I'm doing it, because I don't feel it's going to kick my butt and that it's super hard and all that kind of stuff. I can remember when certain things early on when I was learning to draw, I might have to concentrate more than that. But, you train your eye so that you can not have to concentrate as hard. The idea being that you can see like you think, or as well as you think, and you can observe and so forth. And I may be, there may be a moment where it's like, ooh, look at that. There's some perspective stuff. And without a great amount of thought, I'll rapidly fall into some business of finding axes and working out, angles real quick. Something like that will happen. in another moment, I may be just sort of observing that, like, hey, here's one of those places where it's darker and it makes sense to kind of, not something that may have been a perspective day only kind of thing. So while I go there and we work on it and we talk about it, and that's all good, remember the thing I was saying in the beginning. If you were the master of seeing shapes and you were great at seeing light and dark, you might not know any of this knowledge, meaning you might not have in your head anything 1 point, 2 point, 3 point, vanishing points, horizon lines. None of that might even be there, and you would probably still get the angles right, because if you can perceive an edge, there's, it's there to be seen. Try to throw it all together. Try to get some things in there that really feature working architecturally. Again, the closest neighbor, I think, of perspective days, probably, back early on when we did structural line drawing. And we learned not to be afraid of lots of light, loose lines. And in keeping with the, policy of general before the specific, we would get major information first. So something like this stairwell, I know in my head that, like, these steps are going to gradually get a little smaller and closer together with each sort of increment of them. But first I will generalize them and kind of throw them in there. And maybe if it's really pronounced, sometimes it's really pronounced. There's some windows up here that I feel, the perspective information, like the edges of the buildings that they are a part of, is quite pronounced, right? So I'll play that up, okay? But other times there's information of a perspective nature, and I think I feel that way about these steps. If I squint, the horizontal lines of the steps are almost imperceptible. They fall away. So it's not a place that I want to play it up as much. It might be that the perspective here, dramatic sort of tilt and angle here, makes more sense to talk about, or something like this that I find back here. Just a little bit of that information. So when you're looking at places, things in the world, try to throw it all together, collapse it all together. The main thing you're trying to do is avoid stuff that just looks awkward. Your perspective work, again, err on the side of exaggerating the truth rather than holding back. Your perspective work is not going to be one of these things where I'm going to come along and say, you know what, I stood in the exact same spot. You were actually standing to the left of this. I know you were. God damn it. And so this angle was off. That I can't, I'm not going to do that, and I couldn't do that. What is going to matter is if it looks awkward and the viewer doesn't believe it. It looks unassured, it looks impossible. It doesn't look like it could be right. And if you draw in the right way and none of your angles are backwards, or the main thing I think is probably incongruence. Like I said, somebody will work forever to get this angle right, but then they'll just draw the windows completely one at a time, all by themselves, and that will create a sense of awkwardness. And without getting lines, without using access lines or examining how the tops of the windows all line up or something like that, or because that happens, stuff that is the same height and is in a line, if we draw it one thing at a time, it'll tend to look funny. And inevitably, when we go outside to do this kind of stuff, I'll see some students work really hard on where the walls of a building meet the sky and the angle of that. But then they'll start doing those individual windows, and that will be their undoing. And I'll come along and I'll say, hey, get some lines in place that reflect the axes. They're there. Sometimes it can be very hard to see what's going on. Remember last time I was talking about, just diagrams in the desert versus, say, Pittsburgh. Well, what about something like Delhi? Like there's so much complication with people and vehicles and signs and things. Like the landscape is, and of course, this photo is taken from a window high up. But a lot of the information is completely obscured. Doesn't mean it's not still there. Doesn't mean we can't still find a few key pieces. For example, here, here, here. This building has its axes. This is not one of those super safe ones either. This is only so wide from here to here. So we might have some uncomfortable, crazy, wacky angles coming at us at this building. But then, once we start seeing these crowds of people and all this other stuff, it's just like, oh my gosh. And that makes us want to do one thing at a time. That makes us want to throw perspective out the window and to draw something like this, which I wouldn't discourage you from doing. You might be surprised. You might think that, well, if I get one of these really simple things, that's going to be easier. But if you're remembering everything you're supposed to remember about working light and drawing through and combining all of the stuff that from all our other lessons in the general before the specific, I wouldn't discourage you from getting a really complicated cityscape at all, actually, because if you remember what to deal with and how to deal with it perspective-wise when it's very clear, and you use the other stuff that we've learned, you might surprise yourself. And you might find that complexity is actually kind of helpful to your drawing if you handle it right. There's nothing worse than one that's really, really, really simple, and all these angles are generally correct, but then there's like one trash bin or something there, and it's off, and that's all you can look at, and that makes the drawing look awkward. So, if you've got places in the world that have a lot of visual stimulation and a lot of stuff going on, generalize. Remember the thing about lines, light ones, structural lines, building them up. Don't draw something like an air conditioner as if it's completely in its own world. How does it relate to the building that's attached to? What things do line up? Is there something like the points, of these columns, that runs all the way through, and give yourself a good dose of this kind of stuff, and then throw in, light and shadow and shapes and all this other good stuff. And you might be pleasantly surprised. You might find that, again, students often are. They usually do sort of better drawings when they, think they're going to get their butt kicked. Now, if you try to do a stairwell and you're drawing one step of the stairwell at a time, and you try to perfect it, and then you move to another, that's not necessarily what I'm talking about. I'm talking about something like this, where I might go from doing some angle stuff, but I also might be drawing a big area of a dark shape in my drawing too. In this image I've got of a crowded cityscape where the viewer is quite far away from most of the things. And this is the reality. Not every place is as convoluted as this, right? Sometimes, you know, the very same place, it's a different time of day or night, and the streets are not as busy. But the truth is more like this of a lot of places than those you know, super simplified learning perspective diagram things, you know. So I wouldn't want you to be, you know, terrific at drawing railroad tracks in the desert, you know, because that's all fine and good, but what can you draw, you know, Canal Street when we go to New York? Can you draw, you know, can you draw when you're in Hong Kong? Can you draw when you're in these places where there's a lot going on and still deal? That would be a combination of just sort of understanding basics about perspective, but more about practicing sketching in general and staying loose, staying general, you know, because a lot of this has got like people and little awnings and vehicles and uh, things like this that are best sort of indicated and handled in a sketching fashion. People on bicycles and um, carts and stuff. And can you see what I'm doing? I hope. Okay. Um, Maybe something in between. Maybe something where, okay, not quite that far away. Things are pretty complicated, but not crazy complicated. We've got a couple of pieces of perspective information that are really overt. You know, we got a couple of killers. Should I approach the sign in text? How might I do that if I do that? Well, I guess I'd have to do that generally. I guess I'd have to sort of like generalize. Oh, loose structural stuff. Well, let's try it. Let's give this a go. You know, establish some big overall things, some major angles. I think if you do enough of these, and you're sketchy enough, and you're structural enough, and you get enough into the habit enough of working out the major angle info, drawing through. You got to draw through. You got to be comfortable with. If you dance around things and you're not comfortable with letting lines go through other things, you'll be held back. To be sure, you got to be good with drawing through. You got to be good with making some lines that aren't the ones that you'll keep forever, that just end up in some kind of like supporting role. And you got to work out that axis stuff if you're ever going to get windows and things halfway correct. But I think if you embrace the right stuff, it actually can be pretty forgiving. I would call that last drawing I did, you know, there's a lot in that was very forgiving. You know, I wasn't taking an exam to make sure I could get all that sort of perfected. Like I was generalizing a lot. You know, I was being sketchy about a lot of it. I would do the same here. Work out the angles of that. You know. But this one I saved because I think it has, it's a really good example for what I've been talking about, in that it has that kind of combo of, because of the sun, there's some cast shadow shapes that, like down here, this cast shadow shape, it's like it's just as good. It's below eye level. This is above eye level. This roof, like this over here, is just a real good example of what I was talking about, where I might collapse together my figuring out of certain angles with, well, here's a big chunk of shadow, that is the cast shadow of that thing there with the angles, so I can, I can do some of the, I can really see, Mullins, looking at this one, I can see what you're talking about, like throwing together uh, multiple things that we've done, combining that with this perspective stuff, which is all about, trying to get this angle of the axes acceptable. But this one, with its light and shadow, because of the sun, again, this one makes a lot of sense for that. Here it says Avenue of Youth, so I'm probably not allowed to walk around there. I don't know. I would probably handle that very lightly. It has characters that I don't know. Some of you do. I'd probably begin with some rectangles that those could fit into, and indicate basic stuff at first, knowing that I will come back, and tweak that later, and keep going, get everything in there. I mean, I certainly don't expect you to have to do signage, if you don't want to. I don't consider it, now you might impress me, you might handle some signage, and the way that it sort of looks completely congruent with all this other architectural things has been handled the same way. That's lovely. But things printed on signs are not as important to me as things that are about the structures of architecture. Okay, so if you don't want to do a big sign that says, whatever, that's okay. Here's another case. There's like this big pillar. There's an angle right there. I think it needs to go a little bit up, in keeping with this axis. It's like a little bit, relative to my eye level. See that little bit of angle on it? This one right here. See that? It's like it's got just a little, like, now this is angling the other way. So eye level's probably straight across, be somewhere in here. I don't know. But it's got this terrific cast shadow on the column there. So that's, so if I want to get this angle right, then I can also throw in that cast shadow on this column in my drawing, and, I've made some mistakes already, like this sign, I've got to work out this sign, and I've got it off. I'll just move it. Remember what I was saying about exaggerating the truth? This would be an example of that. I can see up under it, so I'm going to overstate that. And my drawing will probably bear that. Whereas if I had drawn it just flat, it might have looked awkward. And then there's shadows cast. You can see I've got kind of a soft pencil in my hand right now anyway. But there's shadows thrown on this building. And then I'm going to draw those, as well as these windows being, darker glass. Anyway, I hope you get the idea. All right. Okay, let me come back over to the gallery view. And somebody tell me and or show me a big problem with this kind of stuff that you have. If you do, maybe everybody's got it well in hand and they're just having a blast. Or maybe something that I've already said, he's like, yeah, I experienced that. I tried to draw windows one at a time and they looked funny. Have you been finding the axis? Have you been observing evidence of the axes? Do you think you could do that? You can do this kind of perspective studies at the same time that you do all the rest of the kind of sketching of an interior or exterior?
So one thing in particular that I've noticed is if something has a visible bottom or like a slightly visible top, like visible tops and bottoms are really, really hard to get right because if let's say it's a cube, that top doesn't look like a square at all. It's like a weird, like
Mm-hmm.
deformed diamond depending on the
Mm-hmm.
viewpoint.
Right, right. Right. And you have to be ready for everything, especially if it's the closer it is to your eye level, the more of a deformed diamond it will look like because it'll be skinnier, and the angles will be crazier. And draw it that way. Draw what you see. Whatever you do, don't try to make it look more normal. We do this to tabletops. It might be that we see a diamond shaped looks like it's stretched and it's only like that, tall because we only see, it's slightly below our eye level. And what we'll do is we'll draw it like we flip the table up because we know that there's a tabletop there and we feel like we ought to be able to see more of it. But there's a point of view where, it just looks ridiculous. A table can look, and of course, if it's a round table, the ellipse can be a loop so tight that it almost is closed. And that's what we've got to go with. Uh, but I think it's really good to draw things like that. Like those are the things to pick to draw. If you see a crazy angle on something, then draw that. Don't go in the world looking for like nice, comfortable rectangles and cubes. Because you probably won't learn that much. And to get a drawing that really sort of like features a sense of deep space, and is very believable, there's going to be some crazy angles in it, whether that's inside or outside. Okay. What I want you guys to do is make an 18 by 24 drawing now. How many have you done in your notebook, in your sketchbook? How many? The minimum was two, but right. Now, and you're welcome to do it from a reproduction. You can simply search around on the internet. I might just say like pick a place that you really like. You say, well, the place I really like. I'm thinking of Thomas now. Well, I really like this place out in the woods where I saw the deer. Well, that's not going to give you any architectural, you know what I mean? You got trees and all that. As long as it's a place that has, some buildings and some structures and some of this kind of information, so if there's a city or if there's a particular part of a city or if there's a place that you visited or any of that, and you can get a reproduction where you'd be surprised how when people are trying to sell real estate and they'll just get these head-on perpendicular shots of buildings and they're like perspective, they're weak on perspective. um, but if there's a place that you can think of that you just you have a fondness for, you can just pull up some images of that and have at it. But I want you to fill up an 18 by 24. Now the big challenge for this, to move your hand, fairly straightly and make these kind of like light structural things. That's not hard to do at all with our 12-inch, like or smaller kind of like notebook size. But you're going to have to do that on a 24-inch thing, it can become kind of a little more challenging. I get these lines that kind of do this, you know what I mean? They kind of curve and drop off towards the end, and you may have to sort of like practice a little bit, you know, like you feel you're moving your arm, or that you're moving your elbow, or something like that. Uh, but you know, that's the drawing I want you to make this week, is somehow featuring some perspective, okay, built up of light structural lines, you know, and if you don't get any like really funky angles, or you don't get anything that architecturally looks wacky, you know, then add all the information that you like. You give priority to the perspective information. Because we have another model next time to draw for some more figure drawing, and Sketchbook is open this week. Okay, but the drawing assignment that I want is an 18 by 24 architectural drawing with some perspective information in it. It can be an interior or it can be an exterior. Okay. Please don't have it floating in the center. Things should be running off the edge of the paper. There should be a sense that it can, you know, the street or whatever the context is, that it can extend outside the edges of the page, right? And draw it with light lines and find the axes. You know, please don't just do the tops of buildings and then go through and put things in any old way. Find the axes, you know, across the whole side of the building. It'll be there, and use that for everything. So there's going to be a lot of light structural lines to do. That's where the work will be. But if you work all that stuff out so you don't get anything funky, then you can like go in like I was doing in my examples and use everything else you've got: line weight, differences in value, shape, you know, all that kind of stuff, right? You don't limit yourself to like, well, I can only do angle drawings, you know, or whatever. No, you can draw, you know, use everything else you've learned, every perceptual device, you know, and every way of putting pencil on paper, you know, use it. But try to make sure you don't have any wacky angles or any funny looking places on your buildings. You know, if you've got archways, doorways, windows, or just ledges or something like that, and they don't look like they match the rest of the building, keep at it and work them out. And don't forget that thing I said about just taking your pencil, you know, place it over the reproduction, hold it up to the screen, look for what kind of triangle you see, and it'll tell you what the angle is, right? And once you've got one of those angles, just remember the axes, because these things were made, they weren't made like, you know, stuff going every which way. They were made with stuff lining up. We know that if we looked at it totally perpendicular, these would be horizontal lines, right? So if you get the angle of the roof right, you can expect other lines of the axes going through that building to help you get all the rest of the stuff. Making sense? Okay. Um, Send me over, you know, when you have a chance, your sketchbook perspective drawings from last week. But this week's drawing assignment, 18 by 24 architectural drawing. Okay, fair enough, right?
Um, Quick question. I
Yes,
think you already addressed this, but
it's all right.
for the 18 by 24, you want us to draw the perspective lines by hand, or can we use like a straight edge or?
Yeah, I really encourage you. I know there's that tendency, like, oh, I'm going to get a ruler, you know, I'm going to use a ruler. Um, I'm not a believer in that, because um, it's kind of like saying I can't do it. You know,
Okay.
it takes a while to kind of learn. You know, that thing you see me doing where I'm going whoosh 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 whoosh. You know, and I'm sort of stiff arming my hand like this and doing all these like light lines or whatever. but it really is the way. If you practice that, you'll get to where you can, you do it, and then you find it and you put it in heavier. When I've seen people like using a ruler, like they think they got the ruler in the right place and they go, real carefully, and then they're like, oh shit, and it's just sort of like it ends up not helping them and kind of holding them back.
Okay.
Have confidence in yourself. I do, and just practice drawing that way. Even if it's a little off, there can be a sort of a if you get a bold, authoritative quality to drawing that way, you can actually make mistakes and they won't even be that perceptible. Whereas if you use a ruler and you miss, it'll kind of be a glaring sore thumb. So yeah,
Okay.
I wouldn't use a straight edge.
All right. That was the impression I got from what you were saying, but I just wanted to clarify.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Have at it. I do encourage that you find places that you think are really great, or you really like, or you really, now that might be because it's just perspective out the wazoo. It's like, oh, here's something like, look at that, I'm going to do that. But I also think like if you have some kind of connection to the building, for example, seeing something like Harold Washington Library, for me, there's like an additional, it's like I have an additional incentive to try and make the drawing good because it's Harold Washington Library in Chicago, right? If you can find something like that is meaningful, interesting, meaningful, or something to you as an artist, then I think that's good. Okay, so if you don't know, well, what am I going to draw? Let that be your guide. Okay. All right. I hope everybody is feeling all right. And next time we'll be doing some figure drawing. Okay. All right. See you then.
Thank you.
Thank you.